Genes of Light and Darkness. Chapter 5. Dee awoke when cold light filled the barn to the eaves. He'd slept perhaps all of 3 hours. To a dampier like him, it didn't matter whether he worked by night or day, but even his body demanded the occasional respite and sleep. Perhaps the shadow clinging to his exquisite countenance was due to the strain of having to work solely by day of late. The fog had moved in, it seemed, and the whiteness slipped into the barn through the entrance and cracks around the windows, but it was not so thick as to hinder action. All the more so because in Dee's eyes this was no different from midday in fine weather. Making his preparations with characteristic superhuman speed, he exited the barn. His stride was smooth, more like a shadow than a cat. If stealth was an innate characteristic of the nobles, they could hope for no greater silence than Dee possessed. Entering a stable a short distance away, Dee stopped cold. 7 or 8 yards ahead of him, the stone walls of the main house reflected the morning sunlight. Dressed in a white nightgown, Lena opened one of the windows and leaned out into the street. Right below the sill there hung a small window box. Stretching out her hand, Lena snatched up something white that lay in it. Dee saw it quite clearly. It was a single white blossom. Though he didn't know what it was called, this tiny expression of life was a common enough sight along the roads of the frontier. Who could have left it? Pressing it to her breast, Lena looked down the road with an expression bordering on tears. The girl gazed for an eternity down the white road, hazy with fog. Before long, the window shut quietly. Dee went into the stable, came out with his mount, and pointed it toward the ruins. Oh, so quietly, as if trying not to make a sound, as if trying not to shatter a young girl's dream. As soon as Dee was off the mayor's property, he started to gallop at full speed. The horse tore through the mist. The crusted remains of snow flew in all directions. Mist devils out to ravage crops were startled by this early morning rider and drifted down to see what he was all about. But they were crushed before they could even touch him, and were left swirling in his wake. Racing through the village, in less than 20 minutes he'd climbed the hill and arrived at the entrance to the ruins. Hitching his horse to the edge of a shattered stone wall, the hunter entered the courtyard. Fog permeated the ruins. Passing from the corridor to the hall, Dee was going to make straight for the entrance to the laboratory, but he came to a stop almost in the center of the hall. He looked back at a picture on the wall. It was the same painting that put a sparkle in a young girl's eye as she stood before it, saying she wanted to study history. The instant he turned back around and began walking deeper into the ruins, the ceiling and the wall around the door cracked. A red flash of light and savage, gaseous energy came from the crack, headed for Dee. The time it took Dee to see this and make a conscious choice of how to avoid it would be the difference between life and death. The impact swept Dee's feet out from under him and slammed him into the wall to his rear. Thick chunks of stone went flying, and the roar echoed through the hall. Now a mountain of rubble lay in front of the entrance. It would be impossible to get into the rooms beyond without bringing in motorized equipment. Dee was on the floor, his upper body resting against the base of the wall. The flap of his long coat was caked white from the dust that rose from the impact. There was no way he could move. He had taken a blast of energy that destroyed hundreds of tons of rock in the walls and ceiling, and he had been smashed headfirst into a stone wall. Of course, an ordinary person would have been killed instantly by internal injuries alone. To say the least, it was an unhappy coincidence that Dee happened to be passing through the place when the project to block the entrance the figure in gray had mentioned the night before was underway. Page break, indicated by a small cross. A lone traveler advanced on horseback through a forest road a few miles from the village. Bristles covered his rock-like chin, and the atrocious gaze he wore complemented his face perfectly. His look, and the rivet gun at his waist, gave clear testimony to the nature of this man. He was one of the outlaws that roamed the frontier. When there was even a little money to be made, this man would stoop to blackmail or extortion, and he had no qualms about murder, either. The skin beneath his thick, electrically heated coat was carved by countless wounds from bullets and blades, and his right earlobe was missing. The horrible traces remained where it had been ripped off. While he was strangling a young lady in some village way up north, she'd torn it off in her death throes. These last few days, he'd been hard-pressed to find either good grub or a woman. Chances were he was imagining the pleasures that awaited him in the next village, because a vulgar smile surfaced on his filthy lips. What the? Before he pulled back on the reins, the man felt himself doubting his own eyes. 15 feet or so ahead, a young lady stepped out from behind some trees and onto the road. That was enticing enough, but her curvaceous figure burned into the man's retinas. The girl was stark naked. What's this? A frontier whore? Pro or not, I can't figure why she'd be out running around like that. Maybe she's wacko. Although his mind had plodded along that far, the crass thug's reason melted away in an instant, and his brain became occupied solely by deeds that might be done with the girl. Still, he waited a moment, scanning the surroundings with a caution he'd learned through his numerous bloody encounters. No one around. If so, this honey's a nut job, all right. I can have her every which way, and kill her when I'm done. Way out here, I won't have to worry about anyone finding her till she's nothing but bones. His plan, however, didn't prove quite so easy. When the man dismounted with a disarming grin, the girl looked back over her shoulder and, giving him a seductive glance, dashed off into the forest. The curves of her backside drove him crazy. Round and firm as a succulent fruit ready to explode, as only a young lady's could be. Hitching his horse to a nearby tree, he took off after her into the woods, into a world of darkness from which there would be no return. He gave chase for perhaps all of 5 minutes, the breath rasping loudly from his nostrils. Plunging through the same luxuriant foliage that had swallowed the naked form, the man suddenly jolted to a halt. The girl was lying in the meadow right in front of him. His gaze was riveted to her breasts, turning up to remarkable rosy knobs, and her damply glistening thighs. The girl moaned and twisted her lower half. There was precious little chance he'd realize her intent was to show more of her ass than was really necessary. Her pale skin was strangely bloodless, and yet her lips alone were weirdly crimson. but the thug did not notice. He fell on that white body like a black hunk of stone. Sucking and twisting her lips, he forced his tongue into her mouth. And the girl responded, "This is fantastic." Raising his eyes in delight, he glimpsed the face of the girl. She was laughing with the face of a devil. As he tried to jump off, one frail arm held his own body down, and the fingers of the other sank into his right hand as he made a grab for his rivet gun. When the lips that curled back to reveal fangs closed on him, the man finally screamed. And long though it lasted, the deep woods drank it all. Page break, indicated by a small cross. When they were informed that Mr. Meyer was absent from school, Lena felt the eyes of the whole class boring into her. The village had learned of the incident the night before. A monster of hitherto unknown type had broken into a farmhouse near the school, killing and eating a mother, child, and someone who was just passing by. To top it all off, one of the Vigilance Committee members who'd gone missing after he went to check the water level was found dead this morning under the bridge, and the confirmation that the body had been completely free of wounds caused quite an uproar. That much might have been excusable, but when the mayor learned of this and headed straight for the barn, there was no sign of either Dee or the corpse of the monster there. Just the woman sleeping as soundly as ever, but with a mark like a T on her forehead. Lena still wasn't sure if it had been drawn in blood or something else. Of course, the mayor was outraged, and he lambasted the Vigilance Committee for their negligence. On one hand, he told them to ascertain Dee's current whereabouts, but he also admonished them to keep this information secret. But it was a very small village. By the time Lena and the others headed off to school, a sketchy version of the events had made the rounds to almost every home in the area. The fact that Mr. Meyer was the one who had apparently been carried off by the monster was probably leaked by one of the committee members who had visited the teacher's house the night before. Even though the secondary school instructor who came to inform them of their teacher's absence pretended the absence was due to a cold, there was no chance of that shaking the dark conviction that flowed between the students. "Oh, not again. I hate this," thought Lena, sighing with grief. School wasn't always a warm, nurturing place, partly because of the incident that occurred a decade earlier. Abducted by the nobility, the children had returned after some horrible things had been done to them. In a frontier village, that alone was sufficient cause for exile. The humiliation of the examination Lena underwent over the next few weeks opened dark wounds on her soul that still lurked, somewhere, even now. The strain had killed both her parents in rapid succession, and, even after the mayor adopted her, she hadn't been allowed to go near the other children for another year or two. During that time, no matter where she went or what she did, the gleaming, probing gaze of the mayor or Vigilance Committee was locked on her every move. They all know what's going on between the mayor and me, I bet. Lena wanted to blubber like a baby. Most likely they didn't know how he had forced himself on her 17th birthday, but knowledge of their immoral relationship had spread throughout the entire village. Some rather iniquitous relationships were commonly permitted in frontier communities. Villages that could be cut off from the outside world by rain or snow needed a guaranteed labor force. That was their greatest concern. If it weren't purely in the pursuit of pleasure, then any relations, be it between a man and someone else's wife, a mother and her own son, or a father and his daughter, could be termed valuable in so far as it might sow the seeds of new life. In this era, mental defects and other problems traditionally caused by inbreeding no longer existed. For some reason, the nobility had chosen to share the fruit of their genetic engineering expertise with the human race. Hereditary diseases were a thing of the past. Even the names of the diseases were no longer remembered by humanity. No doubt it was the shadow from 10 years earlier that made Lena's spirit sink like lead. Cor had never recovered from his dementia, and that fact alone was enough to terrify the villagers. And then, at the opposite extreme, examinations had determined that both Lena's and Mr. Meyer's intelligence had risen to a startling degree. That was the reason the mayor had adopted Lena. It was also the reason why all her classmates abhorred her relationship with him. A woman made clever at the hands of the nobility. And yet, Lena wasn't openly teased or shunned, thanks to the brightness of her disposition, her splendid bearing, and the efforts of Mr. Meyer, who'd endured the cold shoulder from the villagers and did an excellent job of passing the circuit committee's test to become a teacher. It was impossible to say how much strength Lena drew from seeing him, a weakling and a crybaby in their childhood, standing up to the bullies and protecting her now. Even Cor, who started aimlessly wandering about the village after his parents' premature death, had saved Lena from harm. His decline in intelligence had done nothing to change his innately courteous and gentle character. Lena could still clearly remember how reliably his hulking form had shielded her from the stones other children had thrown. And now she no longer had either of them to protect her. Although Cor was in Fern's care, Mr. Meyer's disappearance was more than sufficient to earn Lena the evil, suspicious glances of the whole class. Well, Lena, we finally know the real reason you were chosen to go to the capital. Her worst enemy, Visca, said, loudly enough for everyone to hear. I don't know what went on up in that castle, but you didn't have to keep all the rest of us living in terror for the past 10 years. As soon as you're gone, things should be pretty peaceful around here again. Yeah, but there'll be hell in the capital, a member of Visca's clique said sarcastically, laughing shrilly. Oh, that does it. I might have to smack someone now, Lena thought, about to arm herself with one of her leather slippers. But she restrained herself because she knew the remarks reflected what everyone in the class felt. The others just didn't say anything because they still counted her as one of their own. That being said, it was undeniable that the whole class had become exceedingly distant since it had been decided Lena would go to the capital. When one considers the import of getting to leave the frontier, there were those who would never understand why the person representing the village was someone with a connection to the nobility. Well, let them say what they will. Just as Visca was about to say something else to Lena, who was now in a fresh and easier state of mind, the substitute teacher from the secondary school came in, and the morning's tribulations were at an end. Advancing rapidly through math and physics, the school day was just about to enter a third period when an unexpected siren resounded. Hey, what's that all about? 3 successive blasts. It means to assemble in the square. Maybe they captured a noble alive. Don't be stupid. Quiet! The teacher ordered. I have to go out. Your class representative will have to accompany me. The rest of you will have a free study period." But he knew the students had ignored him. When he'd gone and taken Callus, the class rep, with him, everyone else busily prepared to leave. This was just what they'd been waiting for. There were some who rattled around in the lockers full of weapons kept in case monsters attacked, and others who raced to get their lunchboxes to bring home. In no time, the sound of the activity grew to quite an uproar, and a second later the students had all vanished, leaving the windows and doors still shaking. Seeing how even the eyes of Marco, the shyest boy in class, gleamed with anticipation, Lena wanted to laugh. On the diversion-starved frontier, children were more inclined to be excited rather than frightened when fearsome beasts ran amok, so long as they didn't directly harm the village. Aside from the giant behemoth or rock, or other colossal monsters of legend, arrangements had been made to defend against most everyday creatures. Plenty of adults were bustling down the street, but they said nothing when they saw Lena with her schoolmates. The square was just about in the center of the village. Even if every one of the village's nearly 1,000 inhabitants were to assemble there, from 120-year-old Gramp Chakra down to the baby born some 4 months earlier, the square still boasted more than enough space to accommodate them all. Whether it was a festival or an exhibition of merchandise by traveling vendors, this was just the place for large-scale events of any kind. When the students arrived with mud flying from their feet, some sort of bizarre show was just about to begin up on the wooden stage that had been dragged into the square. There, beside Vigilance Committee leader Fern in his haughtily puffed chest, was a Type 3 electrified cage, an iron enclosure that could contain supernatural beasts or savage, human-sized birds with high-voltage current. This, in and of itself, was not the least bit unusual, but on seeing the prey it contained, the eyes of one and all went wide. It was a human. However, what plunged every last one of them into the deepest depths of horror wasn't the threatening physique or countenance of this apparent outlaw, but the pair of fangs jutting from his greasy lips. A vampire that walked by day. Is this their leader? This thought screamed in the minds of all of them. The rain had abated near dawn, and the grey clouds that had masked the sky had finally broken. Waves of tranquil light tinted everything a pearly hue, but this square alone was congested with dark, night-evoking fear. Jostling through the elders who were settled before the stage, the mayor climbed a set of folding stairs to stand by Fern's side. He made a great show of ignoring the man in the cage gazing out at him with malicious eyes. "Good people of Tepes," he started to say in a voice much louder than necessary, then paused as he took up the wireless mic he just noticed on the floor. Not a snicker escaped from his listeners. Whether it was a noble or one of their victims, they were looking at a nightmare creature that couldn't possibly exist. A vampire that could act without restraint in the sunlight. The gravity of the situation deeply shook them all. "Good people of Tepes," the voice of the mayor finally echoed to their stupefied ears through the ultra-compact speakers set about the square. "As you know, in our recent trouble with the nobility, 4 from our village have died, and I've burdened our meager finances by hiring not 1 but 2 vampire hunters. But in the end, that was for naught. Happily, it seems they are no longer needed. To be more precise, Early this morning, Fern here caught this thing on the northern road. The leader of our very own Vigilance Committee has good reason to brag. Taking a vampire alive is something few out on the frontier have done. Seemingly frozen by the sight of this vampire scanning his surroundings with blood-soaked eyes, the villagers were finally returned to their senses by the mayor's somewhat coercive compliments. The audience mustered a smattering of applause. Of course, none of them could see the sardonic humor in the situation. Fern took the mic in turn and told how, when the search perimeter had extended beyond the village, he'd run into a man in the woods who attacked him before he could say a word. With the help of his guard beasts, he'd managed to take the attacker alive. Everyone knew far too well the power of guard beasts, but still those creatures wouldn't do much good against a noble, or even against one of their victims. Yet those normally inclined to doubt had proof positive right before their eyes. As the leader of the Vigilance Committee finished his war story, a tumultuous applause broke out. "That's great, Lena. Now you're in the clear." Turning toward the encouraging voice, Lena was taken aback. The class rep, Callus, was smiling at her. A born leader and first-rate organizer, he was clear-headed and quite handsome. But Lena despised the coolness that lurked like a shadow behind his bright, smiling face, and she'd rarely spoken with him. For his part, he was used to the other girls in the village making a big fuss over him, which made approaching Lena a waste of time. "What do you mean? Were you worried for me?" "Of course. After all, we're classmates, aren't we?" At his honeyed words, Lena retched in the cockles of her heart. How stupid can this jerk be? Here he comes, sidling up a little bit closer. "Hey, the mayor's getting ready to slather another address on us," Lena said, as she pinched the palm that had stealthily been placed on her hand. "It's almost certain the fiend in this very cage is the cause of all our recent troubles. That being the case, I propose we slaughter it now and pray that this offering will give us peace. What do you say to that?" And by this point, convinced that the true source of their terror had been captured, the villagers put their hands together as one. And the square was buried in vocal approval. In frontier villages, it was not uncommon for animals to be sacrificed when praying for a bountiful harvest or safety in the coming year. "That's horrible." Without noticing the meaning of the words that spilled from her own lips, Lena felt her heart stop when Callus's shocked expression turned toward her. It was the first time she was ever aware of feeling that way. "Do I pity a vampire?" Suddenly, purple sparks flew from the iron bars of the cage, and the man within shrank back with a scream. "Okay, Fern, finish him off." With a bow to the triumphantly nodding mayor, Fern stepped forward. The long wooden stakes he held in either hand were more like spears. The other members of the Vigilance Committee moved in and surrounded the cage. The vampire in the cage seemed frightened and backed away, only to receive a massive electric shock. Discerning unrest and fear in that atrocious face, the people loosed mocking laughter and catcalls. "You like that? Go on, try and run away again." "Haha, I think it's gonna start bawling. Some noble you are." "Fern, don't kill him with one shot. Do it slow. Real slow." As if to acknowledge the cheering, The Vigilance Committee leader waved to the crowd. Intoxicated with pleasure by this murderous show, the villagers couldn't see that his lips were redder than normal, and that something eerie lingered in his smile. Nobody questioned his assertion that this vampire was indeed a noble, and that the vampire was the cause for the village's woes. The spear lunged forward. The vampire twisted out of the way. Sparks leapt from his right hand, and his exposed back was pierced by a quick thrust of the tip into his right shoulder. Cheers rocked the square. With a faint smile rising on his lips, Fern poised his spear again. Lena pushed forward from the very back of the crowd, sending mud flying everywhere. She shouted, "Stop!" Shoving people out of the way as she ran, she finally got to the stage. "What the hell you think you're doing, Lena? Keep out of this." The girl didn't flinch at the mayor's words. Beautiful face and softly curved body trembling with rage, she opposed everything that was happening here. "You're the one who should keep out of this, Mr. Mayor. I can't believe you'd do something so cruel. You're dealing with a human being." "It's not Mr. Mayor," the old man bellowed. His gray hair fluttered more from anger than from the wind. "I'm your father. Why can't you call me that? Keep out of this, you little idiot. I'll whip the tar out of you later." "I said no, and I mean no," Lena replied, and mentally she tossed her head in defiance. "I couldn't even stand by and watch an animal slaughtered now. Why have these feelings come over me?" As if to push those thoughts back into their hiding place, she said, "Don't you think this is awful? If you were human, you'd be ashamed of yourself for torturing an unarmed person to death. And one locked in a cage, no less." Restraining the mayor, who was about to explode with rage, Fern leaned down off the stage. Thrusting the bloody point of the spear right under Lena's nose, he said, "Oh, I see. Then what you're saying is, it'd be better if we gave it a weapon before we do it, right? Fine by me. Why don't we let you do the honors, little chatterbox? You've had some training with swords and spears, haven't you?" On the frontier, where life and death existed side by side, it was customary for women to learn how to use weapons. Although it wasn't necessary to master gunpowder firearms, crossbows, and laser guns like it was for men, all of them could wield a short spear, a lighter version of a longsword, or a whip. When the head of the spear was thrust before her, Lena grabbed it without hesitation. The wrath she felt toward the mayor and Fern and the villagers, for the entire human race for that matter, wouldn't allow this girl of 17 to be cowed. The mayor went pale, and a clamor ran through the inhabitants of the town. At that moment, a beautiful, rusted voice raced across the ground, leaving the wind twisting in its wake. "That's my job." First part, end.